Well, hello again, Joe Huffines, and it's great to have you back. Hopefully you've been studying with us. This is intended to enhance Bible study, even if you're in connect groups or Sunday school, whatever term you use. Hopefully this is just to give you more Bible study during the week to enrich your learning of the Bible and just to be fulfilled in your Christian walk. Our lesson today, if you want to be turning in your Bible, is in Mark chapter 11. We'll be in verses 15 through 19, and then we'll jump over to chapter 12, and we'll be in verses 41 through 44. Let me ask you a question. If you're like me, I think I know the answer. Do you ever find yourself backing up after you've left your driveway at home and questioning whether you really shut the garage door or not, and you back up to make double sure? I do that all the time, and I say every time, I know I shut that garage door, and yet my heart just would not let me leave the house with any chance of it not being down. And what's the cause of that? Because we have too many things on our mind and we go through the motions. And so I shut the garage door just through an automatic motion because I do it so much, but my mind's not really on it. That brings us to our lesson today. And Jesus is troubled. And we could even say, probably one of the few times in the scriptures that we could say he's angered because people are going through the motions in the temple. And this is the study in this chapter of Mark where we see the money changers and Jesus overthrowing their tables. And we see other examples of people who are believers, or presumably believers, most times Jewish, but not always, just Jesus feels going through the motions of worship. And they have over time, even in spite of their great love for the temple and their feeling that that places God with them, and adorning it in most cases, in spite of all that, they had just turned it into, as he said, a den of robbers and thieves and a place of commerce instead of a place of worship. And so it makes you start thinking, as I did, about going through the motions. And as a Sunday school teacher, I've had people at times mention that they just feel like they've kind of gotten in that mode, and that sometimes they can't remember a few days later what the sermon was about, whether they had any worshipful feeling in their heart, and just kind of an estrangement to God even. And my answer has been at times, and I'll share it with you, I have, when I get in that mode, I just play a little game with myself, and I just imagine Jesus standing at the doors going into the sanctuary, typically after I've been in Sunday school or doing something else, and in the motion of going through the motions. And so I just kind of tricked myself into thinking, Joe, Jesus is standing here shaking his hand and just saying, good to see you again, Joe, on a personal basis. And silly as that may sound, isn't it really basically the truth? I mean, it's his home, and we are there to be with him. And I mean, he could well be standing there knowing I'm there and welcoming me into his house. And so that's our lesson today. You know that there's been 3 temples. Solomon, of course, built the first temple. It was adorned greatly, but the Babylonians destroyed it. And then we got the second temple during the times of the Persians, and Zerubbabel built that, and it was destroyed. And then we got the third temple, of course, in 70 A.D. The Romans came through, and so since then, and by the way, it was approximately 40 years on that last destruction of the temple after Jesus' crucifixion. And so here we are today, and of course we know sadly that the Dome of the Rock, a worship place for Muslims, sits right on top of where Solomon's temple once was. And so, of course, Christ is coming back someday, and he's coming back to Jerusalem, and he will be the temple. We won't necessarily even have to have some facade. He's going to return, and he's going to be the light on top of the hill in Zion. Look with me then at verses 15 and 16 in Mark chapter 11. Let me make sure I said right. Chapter 11, yes. And it says they came to Jerusalem. Now, if you were with us last week, you know that Jesus has finally left Galilee, and then he left some other Gentile areas over around Sidon and Tyre. And he's now on his way to Jerusalem. And of course, he knows what's about to take place there. And his disciples are with him. And it says here, as we continue our study, they came to Jerusalem. So we're now there. And it says, and he went into the temple and began to throw out those buying and selling. So there's the commerce. And of course, you remember what took place is they had to exchange the money that had, of course, been Roman coins into a coinage that would be acceptable to the priest in the temple. And so that became corrupt, and people were making money off of it in the church, in the temple. And that was another thing that disturbed Jesus. And then actually, of course, the Gentiles had what was called the outer court. And it was a pretty large area, but it was excluded to the outer parts of the temple. And that was the only access that the Gentiles had. And all of this commerce that was going on that had become corrupted and was taking away from the purpose of the temple at all, was basically becoming the place where all of this distraction was taking place, and it was another hindrance to any Gentiles that were caring to come and worship in the temple. So the Jews were less bothered than the Gentiles by all of this, and yet all of it was a distraction to the purpose of coming to worship. And that's really the heart of our study today. So we see Jesus is there. He's overturned these commerce tables and the chairs of those selling doves. And of course, if you didn't have something better to offer, then you could offer a dove if you were a poor person. Verse 16 says, and would not permit anyone to carry goods through the temple. Now, you know, let's always try to place this in our times and what we deal with. Can you imagine going to worship at the stockyards? I remember here in Nashville, we used to have a large stockyards downtown. Can you imagine going somewhere with all the hustle and bustle and the things that were not worshipful and trying to conduct a worship service? Well, that was about how Jesus felt, I think, about what was going on in the temple. And by the way, some people feel that this really was a rash decision of Jesus to do this, but it's important that we know the night before, Jesus had come and sat and observed what was going on in this outer court. And so when he did take this action, the next day, it was not with just a rash decision. It was something he had given some thought to. Let's move on. Verse 17 says he was teaching them. And of course, that's been one of the themes of our lessons in recent times too, is Jesus teaching. He's been taking great efforts to teach the disciples. Now here, we see what he's doing. He's in the temple and he's actually teaching the religious leaders, and it says he's teaching them, quote, is it not written? So he loved to pose questions, and I like to teach that way myself. They tried to trick Jesus all the time, and he was masterful at just turning it back on them. And here he is asking them, is it not written, my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations? And in my book, I underscored all nations. That to me says it's not just a Jewish place of worship, it's for all peoples, all nations. And then he makes a definitive statement, not just a question, and says, but you, religious leaders, have made it a den of thieves. Now, if we look back in Jeremiah chapter 7, verse 11, you'll see that about the den of thieves. And like so many other things as we study, we're in Mark in the New Testament, but we're always referring back to Old Testament. Once again, everything's a fulfillment of Scripture. And so this comes from Jeremiah 7:11, and of course Jesus knew the Scriptures. We also have some reference in this passage here to Isaiah 56:7, and that's where the original context was about how foreign converts to Judaism would one day be welcome to participate fully in temple services. And so that's what Jesus' purpose is here. His purpose is to stop this commerce in a place of worship that's there for worshiping God, and also to open the doors to people who are not necessarily Jews. If we move on, we see in verse 18, it says the chief priest and the scribes. Now, the chief priests were typically the Sadducees, and if you remember, they were, in my mind, kind of like the Senate, and the Pharisees were kind of like the House of Representatives. And the Pharisees were the lawyers and the scribes that did the recordings, and the chief priests, the Sadducees, you remember, were the part of the religious body that did not believe in a resurrection. So it says here that those chief priests and scribes heard it, and that's Jesus talking, and started looking for a way to kill him. So now we see their intentions have been obvious, but now it's becoming extremely obvious. And it says, for they were afraid of him, and here's the reason: because the whole crowd was astonished by his teachings. So they are challenging their position of privilege in the temple, and he's too smart for them, just to be frank about it. He's just too smart for them. They can't handle that. Now, it's interesting to note, any time that we see that the Sadducees and the Pharisees come together, because they usually were at odds, something serious is about to happen. And here we see that's what's taking place. They were also interestingly pleased to learn when Judas has stepped forward and is offering to betray Jesus, because that kind of takes the dirty actions off of their hands, and all they can do is stand back in the background and push forward on somebody doing the dirty work for them. Once again, they see this also as a threat to their position, but a threat to the temple itself. And of course, if anything happens to the furtherance of the temple, they're out of work. And so that's what's concerning them the very most. I think one truth in this lesson here already is people respond differently to Jesus. And we see that even today. It amazes me when we have what we do in the Holy Bible and all of the churches on every corner, and great teachings and materials from places like a Lifeway, and all these tools that we have at our disposal, staffs that are trained, and then a lot of people respond to Jesus very differently. And we studied last week indifference by some people, outright obstinance by some people to Jesus, and it's really a shame. And yet one of the things we need to remember is everybody doesn't see things quite the same. Verse 19 says, whenever evening came, they would go out of the city. Now that means the disciples and Jesus. And one reason probably for that was it was no longer safe. We already hear they're looking to kill Jesus. Probably another reason is this is Passover season, and the city's swelling with population, and there's just nowhere to go. There's no room in the inn, if you will. And then probably a third reason is it gave Jesus time to spend some valued time with his great friends Lazarus, Mary, and Martha in Bethany, just 5 miles or so out of town. I think it's somewhere between 5 and 12 miles, but it was close, and he had great friends there and loved to be with them. And knowing this is literally his last days, and in fact we're now to about the last 24 hours of his life, this probably was a good opportunity to spend a little last time with them. Verse 41 says, sitting across from the temple treasury, he watched, and here we see he's watching how the crowd is dropping money into the treasury. And they had large golden urns, kinds of things that looked like, they said, trumpets. And another thing that many of the people were doing was to look kind of hotsy-totsy and drop their money in so it would make a rattle, and everybody could see that they were donating to the temple and perhaps had more money to drop in than someone of lesser means. And that too was destroying what the purpose was for being there or even making donations. And so many of the rich people, it says, were putting in large sums of money. We'll move on to verse 42, and it kind of is an extension of that. It says, then there was a poor widow who came and dropped in 2 tiny coins worth very little. Those coins were called a lepton, and they were the smallest Jewish coin, which was worth 1/64 of a day's wages. So in our terms, I can imagine that this lady was probably coming in and dropping 2 pennies into these trumpets, just 2 little pennies. But Jesus makes a point here in the next verses, and I'm sure you've read it before. Verse 43 says, summoning his disciples, he said to them, this is Jesus speaking, truly I tell you, by the way, he says that 12 times in just this one book of the Bible. Truly I tell you. And of course, all he's saying is, in our vernacular, honestly, and let me tell you such and such. Have you ever done that? Well, he's saying, truly I tell you, honestly, this poor widow has put more into the treasury than all of the others. For they gave all out of their surplus, but she gave out of her poverty, and has put in everything she had, all she had to live on. So let's look at a few summary items on this lesson. I really think it's a good lesson. Again, we're in the last 24 hours of Christ's life. And so here gives us an opportunity to think this week about analyzing, how do we worship? Have we kind of shut the garage door without thinking? Do we come into the church and we've got things about the kids and things about some bills and things that happened that perhaps didn't sit well with us during the last few days, and that's what's on our mind instead of coming in a worshipful experience. Let me just share this little trick again. Just imagine Jesus standing there when you come in, and it would be awfully hard to have those other things on your mind, and certainly things that are not right in your heart. And then this is the last public event that we learn from the Scriptures in Jesus' ministry. So that's where we're at. And then a truth of this lesson certainly was that the widow gave sacrificially. She didn't just give of the excess, she gave of all that she had. And it kind of symbolizes what's about to happen, Jesus giving of himself, which was the ultimate sacrifice. And then she trusted in God to provide for her. Apparently these last little pennies, or this little lepton, was going to be a challenge to her being able to get by and have food perhaps for the next week or two. But she trusted that God would take care of her anyway. It's kind of like the old saying, the birds of the field don't worry about where their next meal's coming from. And lastly, we see here that we need to purge ourselves of anything that's in our way. And just remember this week, I think that when we come into worship, we need to just put all those other things aside and have a pure heart to just be so thankful for what God